Good evening, everyone. We begin the readout tonight with Republicans leaning in on dismantling a woman's right to choose. We face the first big test tomorrow in the political fight for abortion rights when the U.S. Senate will vote on legislation to codify those rights into law. The legislation, however, lacks the 60 votes needed to defeat a Senate filibuster and is expected to fail. This is a moment of real fear and confusion and heartbreak for millions of Americans who stand on the brink of having their bodily autonomy snatched away from them. But for the religious right, it is an excuse for celebration. It is the Holy Grail, finally within reach, the culmination of its decades-long battle to end abortion rights in America. In fact, the religious right is so entrenched in anti-abortion politics, it's arguably their most defining issue. There's even an origin story about this movement being a reaction to the Roe v. Wade decision in 1973. But that's what they want you to think. It's a myth, a hoax, a lie. Back in 2014, Dartmouth historian Randall Balmer did a deep dive into the real origins of the religious right. He also revisited the topic in a piece that dropped today. As Balmer notes, before and for several years after Roe, evangelicals were overwhelmingly indifferent to the subject of abortion, which they considered to be a Catholic issue. According to experts featured in the PBS special God in America, even famed televangelist Pat Robertson and Jerry Falwell, the founder of the Moral Majority, had very little interest in the issue.
It was Catholic leaders more than evangelical leaders at the beginning who were most concerned about Roe v. Wade. In fact, Pat Robertson kind of famously said after the decision was issued that it wasn't necessarily a big concern of his.
Dad was the one who talked Jerry Falwell personally in taking a stand on abortion. Before that, Jerry Falwell said, that's a Catholic issue. It's nothing to do with us. Why would I want to take a stand on that? I'm just a preacher. I want to talk about the gospel.
Now, keep in mind, evangelical Christians were largely apolitical back then. Paul Weyrich, co-founder of the Heritage Foundation and the architect of the religious right, well, he wanted to change that. As Balmer, the historian, explains, the hypothetical moral majority needed a catalyst around which to rally. Weyrich kicked around ideas, pornography, prayer in schools, even abortion. The galvanizing issue would not be abortion, not yet. It was, in fact, an organized fight to protect Christian schools from racial integration. That's right. It was school segregation, not abortion, that brought white evangelical Christians to the polls. Their activism emerged after another Supreme Court decision, 1950s Brown versus the Board of Education decision, which changed the law but not the racism. So white parents were taking their kids out of integrated schools, particularly in the South, and putting them into private schools, segregation academies, as they were labeled. Decades later, religious leaders blamed fellow evangelical and Democratic President Jimmy Carter for IRS actions that removed tax breaks previously enjoyed by those private schools that failed to integrate, though the policy was mandated, in fact, by Nixon. But as Balmer notes, defending school segregation really wasn't the best look for a movement ostensibly based on Christ's teachings. So evangelical leaders searched for a more palatable rallying cry, the key issue that would unite evangelicals around the Republican Party. That issue would become abortion. 5 years later, after Roe, Jerry Falwell gave his very first anti-abortion speech during the midterm election year of 1978. The work of Falwell and Weyrich continued with a fever pitch leading up to the 1980 presidential election, and a movement was born.
Abortion is not a Roman Catholic issue. It is a moral issue, an issue that concerns the human rights of unborn babies who, by the hundreds of thousands, are being murdered in these United States of America.
We're told about a woman's right to control her own body, but doesn't the unborn child have a higher right, and that is to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness?
I am pro-life, and I will be appointing pro-life judges.
Do you want to see the court overturn Roe v. Wade?
Well, if we put another 2 or perhaps 3 justices on, that's really what's going to be, that will happen.
But the right knows how easy it is to be on the wrong end of the culture war, which is why it wasn't enough to just sink its teeth into the Republican Party. They also had to stack the courts. Now, pay attention to this name, Leonard Leo. vice president of the Conservative Federalist Society, whose list of potential justices Republican presidents, including Donald Trump, drew from time and time again during their presidencies. Leo, according to his media guy, knew that the right had lost the culture wars on everything from segregation to contraception to abortion and liberalized Hollywood. So the only way to impose the quote-unquote right thinking was to take the courts. And with his list, he and the Republican Party were perfectly positioned to cement a conservative majority, to give the right everything they ever wanted, a repeal of the promise and progress of the 20th century. And joining me now is Senator Sheldon Whitehouse of Rhode Island, who serves on the Senate Judiciary Committee. And Senator Whitehouse, always good to have you on. You have been one of the lonely voices letting people know about Leonard Leo and trying to get people to focus on this man. You even had a chart up during the Ketanji Brown Jackson hearings. Talk about Leonard Leo's influence in essentially stealing the Supreme Court for the religious right.
So what they did, Leonard Leo was an operative of the Federalist Society. And what they did was they set up within the Federalist Society the selection process for at least the last 3 Supreme Court justices. I don't want to say that the Federalist Society decided it. I think the Federalist Society hosted it. We don't know who was in the room making the actual picks, but we do know that Leonard Leo was wired tight with Don McGahn, Trump's White House counsel, and with Mitch McConnell, who was breaking every possible Supreme Court rule in the Senate to try to pack the court with his judges, and that he had the intention to change the way the American courts see basic rights. And he was going for the courts for exactly the reason you said, which is that they had failed and failed and failed again in the democratic parts of the government. They'd just been blown out. They hadn't been able to accomplish the extreme things they wanted. So they were going to pack the courts with extremists who would act irrespective of public opinion.
And, the thing is, what they did, and as you said, I'm glad you brought Mitch McConnell into this. I mean, there was the chicanery, the McConnell chicanery, denying President Obama his right to choose a member of the Supreme Court, not even giving a hearing to Merrick Garland at the time, but also the lying. These people were prepped very well to get up and say stare decisis and to lie and to pretend that they didn't have this preordained mission to take down Roe. And I'm assuming also to take down the rulings that made contraception illegal. Eventually, they'll go for gay marriage. They're going to go for everything, because what Weyrich really talked about was the fact that they just haven't been able to win these culture wars. And so people, not only do they want to take away rights from people who they think have the wrong thinking, but to give extra rights to those who do have in their mind the right thinking, special rights, corporations, et cetera. But I want to ask you about this, because one of the things that bothers a lot of people about the fact that, Brett Kavanaugh is part of this decision. This guy was investigated for like 4 seconds by the FBI for a credible accusation of assault. You've been one of the senators who said that it was an inadequate investigation. Were these people even properly vetted for lifetime seats on the court? And I mean him specifically.
Brett Kavanaugh was not properly vetted, and we pretty well know it. We know that the FBI was not allowed to do a proper supplemental background investigation once this charge was raised. We know that the FBI very unusually became impervious to information. It was repelling people who were trying to bring it information about Brett Kavanaugh. And we know that when they finally had to give in and accept information, they did that through a tip line, and that the tip line violated the FBI's own tip line procedures, and instead of being sent for investigation, was sent to the White House for presumably a decent burial. So everything about the supplemental BI into Dr. Christine Blasey Ford's allegations was tanked by the FBI, which takes political pressure at the highest levels.
Yeah. Let me ask you very quickly before we go. You've had Ted Cruz lie about the protesters who were in front of the homes of some of these justices, basically saying they're the real thugs and brutes, not the people on January 6th who he calls regular protesters. But you have had serial violence. Let's just put up this clip. Ms. Magazine put it together. 11 murders, 26 attempted murders, 956 threats of harm, 624 stalking incidents, kidnappings, bombings, arsons, attempted bombings. These are the things that have happened in front of clinics that are providing abortions. Why is it that the Supreme Court has essentially ratified the idea that there needs to be, the buffer zones get smaller and smaller around these clinics, but the Senate, which can't do anything, suddenly is passing extra protection for Supreme Court justices while stealing the rights of women?
I was the U.S. attorney in Rhode Island at the time of the Boston clinic shootings. Somebody went into one clinic, murdered the receptionist, shot some other individuals, and then went down the road to another clinic, murdered the receptionist there and shot some other individuals, and then got away on the road. And I went down to our Planned Parenthood clinic in Rhode Island with our U.S. Marshal and stood out front until we had police protection for that. So I remember very well the violence that was associated with those clinic protests. And you will have noticed that in the last Supreme Court hearing, the Republicans brought in a very sweet elderly lady to provide a narrative that everybody out front of the clinics was just providing love and support and compassion for people. When I remember having to push those people back, I remember when people in pink T-shirts had to give people safe passage through the screaming crowds, yelling murder, and it culminated in these shootings with two women murdered by this lunatic. So it was, these were ugly times, and to try to paper that over is really wrong.